I took the graveyard shift at the gas station because it paid $2 more an hour than anything else in town, and I was 20, and $2 an hour felt like a fortune. This was a marathon station off Route 9, the kind with the flat overhang lit up too bright, and a single row of pumps that hummed at night like they were thinking about something. My manager, a guy named Russ who'd worked there for 11 years, trained me for exactly one shift before handing me the keys. The one thing Russ told me, almost as an afterthought while he was pulling his jacket on to leave, was, "Don't prop the back door open, even for 5 minutes, even to take out the trash." I asked why, and he just said the door doesn't like it, laughed like it was nothing, and left. I figured it was an insurance thing, or a raccoon thing. I didn't think about it again. The first 2 weeks were boring, in the specific way 3 a.m. Shifts are boring, truckers, a couple of teenagers buying energy drinks, the register drawer that stuck a little on the left side. Nothing that felt like anything. It was on a Tuesday, slow even by our standards, that I noticed the bell over the front door, an actual brass bell on a curved bracket, the old-fashioned kind, chime once. I looked up. No one was there. The door hadn't moved. I remember thinking a truck must have gone over the speed bump out front and shaken the frame. I went back to restocking cigarettes. For a while, that was that. Everything was fine. I settled into the rhythm of the shift, the particular quiet of 2 a.m. to 5 a.m., when the highway empties out and the only sound is the cooler compressors kicking on and off. Then the anomalies started, small enough that I dismissed each one on its own. First, the back door, the one Russ told me not to prop, was standing open one night when I came in for my shift, even though I'd locked it myself at close the night before, and even though the alarm hadn't gone off. Second, the security monitor behind the counter, an old Crurt hooked up to 4 cameras, started showing camera 4, the back hall camera, frozen on the same still frame for what turned out to be 4 consecutive nights, timestamp still ticking forward, image never changing, like it had recorded exactly one moment on a loop. Third, the number 8 on the price sign out front, the kind with backlit plastic digits you change with a suction cup pole, kept flipping itself overnight so that both gas prices displayed $8.88 over and over, no matter how many times I corrected it. Fourth, and this is the one that got under my skin, the bathroom key. One single key on a big wooden paddle that said men chained to it, went missing from its hook 3 separate times in 1 week and turned up, each time already inserted in the lock from the inside, like someone had locked the door from within an empty bathroom and then simply weren't in there anymore. There was a 5th thing too, that I almost didn't count because it seemed so small at first. The thermostat behind the counter, the one that controlled the store's front section and had nothing to do with any cooler, started reading 61 degrees on nights it was clearly warmer than that. I could feel the heat coming off the coffee machine, feel my own arms sweating slightly under my uniform, while the display insisted, calm and green lit, 61, 61, 61. No matter how many times I reset it, I tried to explain each one away, out loud, mostly to make myself feel better. The back door, maybe the latch was faulty and it hadn't actually caught the night before, and I only remembered locking it because I always locked it, muscle memory lying to me. The frozen camera, an obvious hardware glitch, an old system. I'd seen Russ complain about the DVR unit overheating. The 888, a wiring fault in the sign, something shorting the display board, an electrician thing, not a me thing. The bathroom key, someone, a customer, playing a prank, locking it from inside and slipping out a window that I hadn't checked. The thermostat, a broken sensor, easy enough. Old buildings have old wiring, and old wiring lies about temperature all the time. I ran through every one of those explanations and made myself believe them, because the alternative was a longer thought I didn't want to finish. I even called the alarm company at one point, on my lunch break, and asked, as casually as I could manage, whether their system logged every single door open event or only the ones that tripped it. The woman on the phone told me it logged everything, every sensor trip, no matter how brief, and that my store's back door had not registered a single opening in the past 6 weeks. I sat with that for a long time after I hung up, turning it over, because it meant either the sensor itself was broken in a way that happened to only ever fail on that one door, or the door had never actually been opened by anything the sensor was built to notice. I brought it up to Russ once, carefully, framing it as a question about the alarm system rather than anything stranger. He told me the sensor had been acting up for years, which matched what I wanted to hear closely enough that I let it go, even though something in the specific way he said it, too fast, too rehearsed, made me suspect it wasn't the first time he'd had to give that exact answer to someone new. It was a Thursday, close to 4 a.m, when I heard the bell chime again. I looked up from the counter. Nobody there. The door sat still in its frame, and this time, before I could go back to what I was doing, I heard, very clearly, from the back hallway, the one with camera 4, the one behind the door Russ told me never to prop, a single set of footsteps, not walking toward me, not walking away, just once, like someone had shifted their weight, 1 foot, and then gone completely still, the way you go still when you know someone's listening for you. I didn't go back there. I stood at the counter until the sky started going grey outside the windows, and then I went home and didn't sleep. I still work that gas station, though I switched to the evening shift about a month after that night. Told Russ I had school stuff, which wasn't a lie exactly. He didn't ask any follow-up questions, which told me more than anything he could have said. A few weeks into evenings, I worked up the nerve to ask him, carefully, how long he'd owned the store before he stopped taking the overnight shift himself. He thought about it longer than the question should have required, then said longer than I should have, and went to restock the coffee filters, and that was the end of the conversation. Whatever's back there, past that door, in the hallway with the one frozen camera, I don't know what it is, and neither I think does Russ. He just knows not to prop the door. I was 26, driving alone from Ohio to Colorado to start a new job, and somewhere in western Nebraska, well past midnight, my low-fuel light came on, with nothing around but flat, dark farmland on either side of the interstate. My phone said there was a station 11 miles up an exit I'd never have taken otherwise, a 2-lane road that peeled off into nothing. The station, when I found it, was a single-pump Sinclair with the green dinosaur logo. The paint on the sign faded almost to nothing, and one light on inside, fluorescent, humming, that particular colour of white that makes everything look slightly sick. There was an attendant, an older man, maybe 70, sitting on a stool behind the counter, reading a newspaper that I'd swear was folded to the same page it had been folded to when I walked in and when I walked out 20 minutes later. He told me, while I was paying, in this very flat, very matter-of-fact voice that the bathroom around back was out of service, has been for years, don't bother. I said sure, no problem, and didn't think anything of it. Gas station bathrooms are out of service all the time. For a few minutes it really was nothing. I pumped my gas, went inside to grab a coffee for the road, made small talk with the attendant about the weather, which was cold and clear, nothing dramatic. Everything about the place felt sleepy and ordinary in the particular way that only very late, very rural stops do. The shelves behind him were stocked the way small rural stores always seem to be, half practical and half nostalgic, engine oil, fishing lures, a rack of postcards for a town that probably didn't get many visitors anymore. I remember thinking, standing there, waiting for my coffee to finish pouring, that the place had the specific stillness of somewhere that had simply stopped changing at some point, years ago, and just kept running on habit. Then I noticed things, one at a time, the way you notice things when you've had too much energy drink and not enough sleep, and your brain starts snagging on details it would normally let go. The coffee pot behind the counter was full and freshly made, steam still coming off it at almost 2 a.m. at a station that couldn't have seen another customer in hours. The clock on the wall, an old analog one, read 2:15, but my phone said 1:40, and when I glanced back up 10 minutes later, it still read 2:15. There was a second stool behind the counter, empty, angled slightly toward the attendants, like someone had just gotten up from it, and out the window, around the side of the building, past the out-of-service bathroom he'd mentioned, I could see a single light on inside it, a bathroom he'd told me nobody used, lit from within. There was a fifth thing that I only noticed on my way back to the register to grab a receipt I'd forgotten. The newspaper the attendant kept reading had a date printed at the top of the page, and it wasn't old, it was that day's date, current, correct, but the specific page it was folded to, a page of classifieds, listed a phone number in one of the ads that matched, digit for digit, except for the area code, the number printed on the station's own faded exterior signage, the one advertising towing services that clearly hadn't operated in years. I told myself the coffee pot ran on a timer and he just hadn't gotten to it. I told myself the clock was simply broken, stopped at 2:15 permanently, and I'd misread it the first time out of tiredness. I told myself the second stool was just storage, nothing sinister about an extra stool. I told myself the bathroom light was a motion sensor fixture, the kind that flips on for no reason, on its own timer, unconnected to any actual person being inside. I told myself the classified ad was a coincidence of area codes, a printing error, nothing that required the number to mean anything at all. I almost believed all of it. I really did. Right up until I was walking back to my car, and I passed close enough to that bathroom to hear, from behind the door marked out of service, the unmistakable sound of a sink running, not dripping, running, full pressure, water hitting a basin. I stopped. I did not open that door. Beneath the gap at the bottom, in the thin strip of light from the fixture inside, I could see the edge of a shadow crossing back and forth, slow, unhurried. The particular rhythm of someone just standing at a sink, washing their hands, in a bathroom that had supposedly been sealed shut for years. I looked back through the station window at the attendant, who was still reading his newspaper, still on the same page, and who did not look up at me at all, Not once, the entire time I stood there. I got in my car and pulled back onto the 2-lane road faster than I probably should have. About a mile out, checking my mirror out of some instinct I still can't explain, I saw that the station's one light, the inside light, the fluorescent one, had gone dark. The whole building was black. I told a friend about it a few days after I'd settled into my new place in Colorado, mostly as a strange story to tell over dinner, and she asked, half joking, what the attendant's name tag had said. I realized, describing it back to her, that he hadn't been wearing one at all, and that I hadn't thought to notice that until she asked. It's a small detail. It's the kind of detail that shouldn't matter. It stayed with me longer than almost anything else about that night. I never found that exit again on the drive back through, months later, for a visit. I looked for it. The mile marker's there. The exit isn't. My uncle left me a little money when he passed, and I used most of it to buy a small independent gas station on the edge of my town. One of those places that had changed hands 4 times in 10 years and never quite made it. Sun-bleached signage, 2 pumps, a mini-mart the size of a closet. I was 31 and had never run a business in my life, but I liked the idea of being my own boss. And the price was low enough that I told myself I couldn't really lose. The previous owner, a tired-looking man who signed the papers fast and left faster, mentioned almost in passing that the walk-in cooler in the back runs a little cold. Ignore the thermostat. Just don't stand in there too long with the door shut. I laughed and said sure, thinking it was just an old cooler with old wiring, the kind of thing you inherit with a fixer-upper. The first month was, frankly, exciting in a way that first months of owning something usually are. I repainted the sign. I got new snack racks. Regulars started trickling in. An old farmer named Pete, who bought the same brand of chew every morning. A couple of high schoolers who'd stop for slushies after practice. I even started keeping a little notebook of regulars' names and usual orders, the kind of small-town touch I figured would keep people coming back. Everything felt like it was working out, better than the sun-bleached sign and worn-out pumps had led me to expect when I first signed the papers. It was the small things that started to snag. The walk-in cooler thermostat, which I'd set to 38 degrees, would read negative numbers, not just low, negative single digits below 0, every single morning when I opened, despite the compressor running normally and nothing frozen solid inside. The register tape, when I went to reconcile it at the end of certain nights, had an extra line item printed on it that matched no product in my inventory, just a string of numbers, always at 3:14 a.m., a time the store was closed and locked. A specific pane of the front window, lower left corner, kept fogging up from the inside, condensation, the kind you get from body heat and breath, on mornings when the heat inside the store had been off all night and the building was cold as the parking lot. And Pete, my regular, mentioned to me, casually over his morning chew, that he'd seen someone standing at the pumps at 4 a.m, driving past on his way to the dairy farm, just standing there, not pumping anything, not near a car, on 3 separate mornings, always the same spot. Around the same time, I found something in the back office, going through a box of the previous owner's leftover paperwork I hadn't yet gotten around to sorting. An old maintenance log, handwritten, listing service calls on that same walk-in cooler stretching back over a decade, every single entry noting the same complaint: runs cold, thermostat wrong, and every single technician's note ending the same way: no mechanical fault found. I ran through the sensible explanations one by one because I wanted this business to be a normal business and not the kind of thing people whisper about. The negative thermostat readings, probably a faulty sensor, an old unit. I made a note to get it serviced, and the maintenance log just meant it was a long-standing, harmless quirk. Nothing new, nothing tied to me. The 314 register line, some glitch in the ancient POS system left over from the last owner, a ghost transaction in the software sense, not the other sense. The fogged window pane, maybe a draft, a gap in the seal letting in humid air that condensed unevenly. Pete standing at the pumps. Pete was 74 and had, by his own admission, a few too many some mornings. Maybe he saw someone waiting for a ride. Nothing more. I want to say those explanations held. For a while they did. Then, on a night I stayed late doing inventory, I went into the walk-in to grab a case of soda, and the door that only opens outward, that I had propped with a rubber wedge specifically so it wouldn't shut behind me, swung fully closed while I stood in there. No draft, no reason. Latch clicking shut from a mechanism that requires a hand to turn it from the outside. I stood in the dark and the cold for what felt like a full minute, my breath coming out in visible clouds despite the cooler never running that low in 6 months of ownership, before I found the handle and let myself out. When I did, the thermostat on the wall outside the cooler read -11. The store's front bell, I'd installed one, an old brass one I liked the look of, chimed once, on its own out in the empty mini-mart, while I was still standing there, catching my breath in the cooler doorway, and for one full second before I got my legs moving again, I could have sworn the temperature on my own skin, standing outside the cooler in a heated store. Hadn't caught up with the rest of the room at all. I still own the station. Business is good, actually, better than I expected. I got the walk-in service twice, and both technicians said there's nothing wrong with it mechanically, which by then didn't surprise me at all. I found the old maintenance log again a few months later, meaning to finally throw it out, and noticed, on the last page, in different handwriting than the rest, a short note that wasn't a service entry at all, just a date, no longer legible, and beneath it, still cold, still nothing there, learn to live around it. I don't know which of the 4 previous owners wrote that. I've decided I don't want to know. I don't ask Pete about the pumps anymore, and he's stopped bringing it up, though sometimes, in the mornings, I catch him glancing at that spot before he comes inside. I'd been driving trucks for 6 years by the time this happened, hauling freight up and down the I-70 corridor, and I knew most of the truck stops between Kansas City and Denver the way you know your own hallway in the dark. There was one place, a smaller station off a service road outside a town so small it didn't have a stoplight, that I'd stopped at maybe a dozen times over the years without a single strange thing happening. It had good coffee and cheap diesel, and a night manager, a woman named Darlene, who always remembered my name. On this particular run, Darlene wasn't there. A new guy was working the counter, younger, maybe early 20s, with the specific kind of nervous energy that didn't match the slow, uneventful job of running a night counter at a rural truck stop, the kind of nervous you'd expect from someone who'd just been told something they weren't sure they believed. When I asked where Darlene was, he just said, "She doesn't do this shift anymore." in a tone that closed the subject and told me, unprompted, which struck me as strange even then, that if I parked overnight in the lot, I should stay on the west side, away from the tree line at the back edge of the property. I said sure, figured it was a wildlife thing, coyotes or a bear that had been spotted, and pulled my rig around to the west side like he asked. For the first hour or two, nothing. I ate a sandwich in the cab, watched some show on my phone, did my logbook, kept half an ear on the CB the way you do out of habit more than necessity. The lot was quiet in the specific way truck stops get quiet at 1 a.m, a few other rigs idling, their running lights glowing orange in rows, the diner attached to the station long since dark and locked for the night. I remember thinking it was a good spot to get some real rest before an early start the next morning. Then I started noticing things I couldn't quite let go of. First, every single rig parked on the east side of the lot, the side I'd been told to avoid, had its cab curtains drawn shut, even the ones I knew belonged to drivers who never bothered closing them, guys I recognized by their trailer decals. Second, the tree line back there, when I glanced at it, had absolutely no wind moving through it, despite a breeze steady enough to rock my own truck slightly on its springs. Third, my CB radio, which I hadn't touched, picked up a stretch of pure static on a channel I never use, static that pulsed at even intervals, almost like breathing, for close to 10 minutes before cutting off. Fourth, when I went inside around 2 a.m. for more coffee, the nervous new guy was standing at the window facing the tree line, not the register, not the door, just watching it, and he didn't turn around until the bell over the door, the same old brass style you see at half these places, chimed as I walked in. Even though I'd been careful not to let the door swing, there was a fifth thing I almost missed entirely, walking back to my truck after that coffee run. Every rig parked on the east side, the curtained ones, had its engine running, not idling for warmth, since the night wasn't cold enough to need it, and not for the ack, since none of the windows showed condensation the way a running cab usually does in a parked lot. Just running, all of them, quiet, wasting diesel for no reason any driver I know would tolerate on his own dime. I talked myself through it, the way you do on a long night alone. The curtains, plenty of guys close them out of habit or superstition, nothing to do with me. The still trees, a trick of the wind, maybe a windbreak of buildings blocking that one section of the lot. The CB static, dead channels do that, atmospheric interference, nothing personal. The kid staring out the window, bored night shift kid killing time, nothing more sinister than that. The idling engines, drivers forgetting to shut them down before climbing into their sleepers, an easy enough thing to do when you're running on no sleep. Nothing that needed all of them to have made the same mistake on the same night. Around 3:40, I woke up. I hadn't meant to fall asleep, but I had, to the sound of something dragging slowly along the outside of my trailer, metal on metal, slow enough that it took nearly 30 seconds to travel the length of the trailer from front to back. I sat completely still in my sleeper cab. I didn't look out. I've pulled a lot of night shifts, and I have never in my life wanted less to look out a window. When it reached the back of the trailer, it stopped. Then, once, I heard what I can only describe as a single knuckle, or something shaped like one, knock against the trailer door itself. Twice, then nothing. No footsteps walking away. No sound of anyone crossing the gravel back toward the tree line. Just a silence that felt, somehow, occupied rather than empty. the particular quiet of something standing still on purpose, close enough that I could have sworn I felt the cab shift very slightly on its springs, the way it does when a hand rests against it. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. When the sun came up, I walked around my rig before pulling out, and there was a long, thin scrape in the paint down the trailer's flank, at exactly the height a person's hand would drag if they were walking alongside it. I asked the day manager, an older guy, if anything had happened to Darlene. He got quiet, told me she'd had some trouble out back a while ago, and changed the subject before I could ask what kind. I ran into Darlene once more, almost a year later, at a different truck stop 2 states over. She was working there now, further from home than made sense for someone who talked about that first station like it was hers for life. I asked how she liked the new place. She said it was fine, and then, unprompted, asked if the new kid was still doing the window thing, and when I said yes, she just nodded slowly, like she'd been hoping the answer would be no. I still run that route. I still stop for the diesel. I always park on the west side. We were driving from Michigan down to see my wife's parents in Tennessee. The 2 of us and our 9-year-old son, Eli, in the back seat with his headphones on. It was late, close to 11 at night, when we stopped for gas at a station just off a rural exit somewhere in Kentucky, one of those places built decades ago and never really updated. Brick facade. One of those old mechanical pump price displays with the rolling numbers instead of digital ones, and a bell over the door, the old brass kind, that chimed as I walked in to pay and use the restroom while my wife stayed with the pump. The cashier, a heavy-set man in his 50s, was friendly enough, made a joke about the Michigan plates being a long way from home, and mentioned, while ringing me up, that the restroom light sticks sometimes. Give the switch a couple flicks. I said no problem, thanked him, and went to find it. For the first stretch of that stop, everything was completely, boringly normal, the kind of pit stop you forget within the hour. Eli wanted a specific brand of chips we didn't have at home. My wife topped off the tank and checked the tire pressure like she always does. The night air was warm for the season. Nothing about any of it registered as strange. It was on the drive out, maybe 20 minutes down the highway, that the small things started stacking up in my head, the way they do when you're tired and driving and your mind starts turning things over uninvited. First, Eli, from the back seat, asked, casually, like it wasn't a big deal, why the man in the mirror had waved at him while he was in the bathroom, when I'd been the only one in there with him, and I definitely hadn't waved at anyone, hadn't seen anyone else in that small single-stall restroom at all. Second, my wife mentioned that while I was inside, she'd watched the station's price display, the mechanical rolling number kind, flip on its own from the correct price to a string of 8s, all across both the regular and premium columns, and then flip back, without anyone touching it, in the 2 or 3 minutes I was inside. Third, I realized, going back over it, that the restroom light the cashier warned me about had never once flickered or stuck the entire time we were in there. It had worked perfectly, which meant either the cashier was wrong about his own building, or he'd been warning me about something else, and used the light as an easier thing to say out loud. Fourth, Eli, unprompted, said the man in the mirror had the same shirt as the man behind the counter, except the man behind the counter had been wearing a name tag and a collared polo. Plain. Nothing distinctive, and Eli couldn't have known what the cashier looked like at all, since he'd stayed in the car the entire stop and never once saw him. There was a fifth thing, the smallest of all of them, that I only put together later, going back over the receipt from that stop. The timestamp printed at the bottom read 10:58 p.m., but the clock on my own dashboard, synced automatically to my phone, had read 11:14 when I climbed back into the car, a 16-minute gap for a stop that by every account from both my wife and me had taken closer to 5. I did what you do when your kid says something like that at 11 at night in the back of a car. I explained it away, calmly, for his sake and mine. Kids see reflections weirdly in older mirrors, especially the warped, cheap ones gas stations install. The price sign was probably just an old mechanical fault, something with the rolling gears sticking and slipping, nothing supernatural about outdated equipment glitching. The light not flickering, the cashier probably just repeats that line to everyone as a script, an old habit from when it did stick, long since fixed and never updated in his head. The matching shirt, kids notice colours and shapes more than details, and the same shirt could mean almost anything to a 9-year-old, a coincidence dressed up as a detail. The 16 missing minutes, a register misprint, a clock out of sync somewhere in the chain. Nothing that required time itself to have behaved strangely, just paperwork being paperwork. I want to be clear that none of these, on their own, would have kept me up that night. It was only laying them all out together, driving in the dark, with my wife asleep beside me and my son quiet in the back, that they stopped feeling like 4 unrelated oddities and started feeling like 4 pieces of the same thing, arranged in an order I didn't like. I mostly believed myself, right up until about an hour later, stopped at a rest area for the night, when Eli, half asleep, mumbling, not fully awake, said, out of nowhere, he said to tell you the bathroom light doesn't stick, it's just off, and then fell fully asleep before I could ask him anything else. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time after that, engine off. My wife already dozing beside me, turning that sentence over and over, because there was no way for my son to have known that detail at all. I'd never repeated the cashier's exact wording to either of them, not once, and it matched it word for word. I didn't sleep much that night, even after we stopped for good at the rest area, running the sentence back through my head, checking it against every possible way Eli could have picked it up on his own, and coming up empty each time. Children repeat things. That part isn't strange. What was strange was the specificity, the exact phrasing, delivered in a voice that wasn't quite his usual sleepy mumble, flatter than that, almost reading it rather than remembering it. We drove that route 2 more times over the following years for holidays, and both times, without discussing it with each other beforehand, my wife and I took the long way around that exit, adding almost 40 minutes to the drive each time, neither of us willing to be the one to suggest going back the direct way. On the second of those trips, passing near enough on the highway to glimpse the exit sign in the distance, I noticed, or thought I noticed, at highway speed, at night, which I'll admit isn't much of a claim, that the sign for that exit no longer listed the gas station by name the way it once had, just a generic fuel icon, the kind you see for exits where a business has closed. Eli, now a teenager, doesn't remember saying any of it, and we've never told him. Some nights, though, when he's home from school and the house is quiet, I'll catch myself glancing at the bathroom mirror in the hallway a beat too long before I flip the light off, and I couldn't tell you exactly what I'm checking for. I drove for a rideshare app on weekend nights to make extra money while I finished school, mostly airport runs and bar pickups. Nothing that ever felt dangerous or strange in the 2 years I did it. Late one Saturday, after dropping a fare near the edge of town, my app showed a gas station a few miles off my usual routes with the cheapest price in the area. So I pulled off to fill up before my next ride request came in. The station was small, independently run, the kind with a hand-painted sign instead of a corporate logo, and a single employee behind the counter, a woman maybe in her 60s, polite but clipped, wearing a cardigan that seemed too warm for the mild night, who told me while I paid inside that the car wash on the side of the building was closed for the night, machines acting up. Don't use it even if the light looks green, and went back to her paperwork without waiting to see if I had questions. I said sure, no plans to use a car wash at midnight anyway, and went back out to my car. For a stretch after that, it really was uneventful. I sat in my car finishing a phone call with my mum while the tank filled, watched a couple of other cars come and go, checked my app for the next ride, half listened to a podcast playing low through my speakers. Ordinary weekend night gas station stuff. Nothing that would make it into a story if it had ended there. The lot itself was small, maybe 6 or 7 parking spots total, with the car wash bay tucked off to one side behind a chain link fence that had seen better days. Then I clocked a handful of things that didn't sit right, each easy enough to dismiss alone. First, the car wash bay, which the woman said was broken, had its green ready light on the entire time I was there, cycling on and off in a rhythm too even to be a malfunction. On for exactly 10 seconds, off for exactly 10 seconds, like a heartbeat rather than a broken switch. Second, I noticed, parked at the very back of the lot near the wash bay, a sedan with its headlights on and engine running, empty, no driver visible in it at all, that hadn't moved the entire 20 minutes I sat there. Third, my rideshare app, without me touching it, refreshed and briefly displayed a ride request from a pickup location listed simply as gas station car wash bay, with no name attached and no way to accept or decline it before it vanished on its own. Fourth, when I glanced back at the store window, the woman behind the counter was staring directly at the car wash bay rather than at her paperwork, completely still, for long enough that I checked twice to make sure she was actually moving at all. There was one more thing, small enough that I only remembered it afterward, going back over the whole stop in my head on the drive home. The gas pump I'd used had a sticker on it, the kind stations put up with a maintenance date, and it read that the pump had last been serviced and calibrated that same day, which struck me as an odd coincidence for a rundown. Half-abandoned feeling place with a permanently broken car wash and an owner who didn't seem like she kept up with anything regularly at all. I explained every piece of it to myself, sitting there in my car, the rhythmic light, probably just a wiring short cycling the relay, an odd but mechanical explanation, the empty running sedan. Someone had probably gone inside to use a restroom around the side, left their car running out of habit, nothing more. The phantom ride request, an app glitch, a test ping, a location tag error, common enough with rideshare software that it barely registered as odd. The woman staring, she was probably just watching for whoever owned that unattended running car worried about it. Nothing about me at all. The freshly serviced pump, a coincidence of timing, a routine maintenance visit that happened to fall on the same day. Nothing that needed to mean anything about me pulling in. I finished fueling and was about to pull out when my phone buzzed with an actual, acceptable ride request. Same pickup location, gas station car wash bay, this time with a name attached, a name I didn't recognize, and an ETA that put the passenger arriving in 0 minutes, already there, at a bay the employee had told me was broken and unusable. The app's little map preview, the kind that shows a pin at the pickup spot, showed the pin sitting exactly at the center of the wash bay's entrance, right where that even, rhythmic green light kept pulsing on and off like a slow heartbeat. I did not accept that ride. I drove straight home, cancelled my account for the night, and didn't drive again for almost 2 weeks. When I finally worked up the nerve to look the address up out of curiosity, the station's listing on the map app showed the car wash had, according to public reviews going back over a year, never worked, permanently closed, long before that night, and one review, posted 8 months earlier, simply said, "Don't wait for the green light." With no other explanation and 40-some replies underneath it, none of which I let myself finish reading. I never went back to fill up there again, cheap gas or not, and I've since made it a habit to check reviews before ever pulling into a station I don't already know, which my roommate thinks is an overreaction to what was, in her words, probably just a broken sign. I let her believe that. I was 17, working my first real job at a gas station near my high school, and after a month of always closing with a co-worker, my manager finally trusted me to close alone on a Wednesday night. Nothing that felt like a big deal at the time, just me, the register, and an hour of restocking before locking up at 11. My manager, a middle-aged woman named Carol, walked me through the closing checklist that first solo night and added, almost as a footnote while grabbing her purse to leave early for a doctor's appointment, that once I'd flipped the sign to closed, I shouldn't unlock the door again for anyone, no matter who it is, no matter what they say, and to just call her cell if there was ever a problem. I said okay, assumed it was a general safety and liability thing every manager probably says, and didn't think much more of it. The first half of the shift went exactly like every other shift I'd worked there. A handful of customers, a guy buying lottery tickets, restocking the cooler, wiping down the counters, texting a friend from school in the slow stretches between customers. Completely normal, forgettable, the kind of shift that blurs into every other one you've worked, made a little more exciting only by the fact that it was mine to run alone for the first time. No one looking over my shoulder to double-check the till. It was after I flipped the sign to closed, locked the door, and started my final walkthrough that things started stacking up. First, the bell over the door, the same old-fashioned brass one every location in the chain, seemed to have chimed once on its own, even though the door was locked and hadn't moved, and I remember standing very still afterward, waiting for it to happen again, which it didn't. Second, going through the security footage log the way Carol had shown me, I noticed camera 2, the one covering the parking lot, had a full 90 seconds of static exactly at 10:58 p.m, 2 minutes before I'd locked the door, with no explanation in the system logs for the interruption. Third, I found, In the walk-in cooler, a single six-pack of a beer brand we didn't even stock, sitting upright and perfectly centered on an otherwise empty shelf, with a thin layer of frost on it despite the cooler having been restocked and wiped down not 2 hours earlier by me personally. Fourth, and this is the one I still think about, I heard, faintly, from just outside the locked front door, someone say my name, not shout it, not knock, just say it, once, quiet, like they were right up against the glass, and when I looked up, there was no one visible through the door or the windows on either side of it. There was a fifth thing, right at the start of that walkthrough, that I hadn't thought much of until everything after it happened. The thermostat display by the front door, which controlled nothing but the store's own heating, briefly flashed a string of letters instead of a temperature. Gone before I could fully read it, back to normal the next time I glanced over, and the only reason I noticed at all was that I happened to be looking directly at it when it happened. I ran through the reasonable explanations the way you do when you're 17 and alone and trying very hard not to be scared. The bell, an air current from the ack kicking on, a vibration through the frame, nothing that required a person. The static on camera 2, an old system, cheap Divar hardware, the kind of glitch Carol had complained about before. The strange six-pack, probably a customer had grabbed it, changed their mind, and stuck it on the wrong shelf before I did my walkthrough, and I'd simply missed it the first time. My name being said, I told myself it was a customer outside in the parking lot, talking to someone else, a name that sounded like mine, carried oddly on the night air, the flickering letters on the thermostat, a display error, a dying pixel board, nothing that spelled anything, because I hadn't actually read it clearly enough to say for certain that it had. I got through the rest of the walkthrough telling myself all of that, right up until I did the final check of the door before leaving out the back, and saw, through the front glass, in the reflection of the store's own interior lighting, a shape standing directly behind where I would have been standing, tall, still, close enough that in the reflection it seemed to take up most of the space just behind my own shoulder, gone the instant I turned around to look at the actual space instead of the reflection. I did not investigate. I left out the back, set the alarm from outside like Carol had shown me, and sat in my car in the parking lot with the doors locked, headlights off, watching the dark storefront in my rearview mirror until my ride showed up 7 minutes later, which felt at the time like the longest 7 minutes of that entire year. I worked there for another year after that night, but I never once volunteered for another solo closing shift, and Carol never offered again either, though she also never explained what no matter who it is was supposed to mean, and I never asked her to. Years later, back in town for a visit, I noticed the store had new owners, a new coat of paint, a new logo on the sign, everything updated except, oddly, the same old brass bell above the door, the one thing they'd apparently kept from the original building, for no reason I could think of. I didn't go inside to ask why. I ran a small gas station for 34 years, the kind of place with 2 pumps and a mini-mart barely bigger than a living room, the same one my father had run before me and his father before him, out on a quiet stretch of state highway that most people only used to pass through on their way somewhere else, when it finally came time to retire. The highway traffic had thinned to almost nothing over the years, and there was no one left in the family who wanted to take it over. I decided to work the very last night myself, alone, closing it down properly one final time before the sale went through the next morning. My father, near the end of his life, had told me exactly one thing about that building that I never fully understood. He said that no matter how empty the place got, or how long I'd owned it, I should never be the one to turn off the bell over the door, the old brass one, original to the building, on the very last night, and that someone or something else would need to do that instead. I remember laughing about it at the time, chalking it up to an old man's superstition, the kind fathers hand down without explanation, because the explanation itself feels embarrassing to say out loud. For most of that last night, closing up felt exactly like closing up any other night across those 34 years, wiping the counters one final time. Counting a register drawer I already knew the contents of by heart, turning off the coolers section by section. It felt, if anything, almost peaceful, a quiet goodbye to a building that had quietly held up my whole life. Then, working through that final closing routine, small things started catching my attention the way they hadn't in decades of ordinary nights. First, the old bell above the door, which I'd heard chime an untold number of times over 34 years, chimed once more on its own while I stood at the far end of the counter, nowhere near the door, with the door itself locked and still. Second, the register drawer, which I'd already counted and closed, sprang back open on its own, exactly to the same total I'd counted the very first night I ever worked that counter as a teenager helping my father, a number I hadn't thought about in over 3 decades and could only have recognized because I'd written it, by hand, in an old ledger my father kept, one I hadn't looked at in years. Third, the thermostat on the old walk-in cooler, long since decommissioned for the sale and powered down that morning, read a temperature on its dead, unpowered display anyway, one number lower each time I glanced at it across the night. Fourth, the shape of frost on the inside of the front window in that same lower left pane customers over the decades had occasionally, half joking, said looked like a person standing there, was clearer that night than I had ever once seen it in 34 years of watching it form and fade with the seasons. There was a fifth thing, the one I've turned over the most since that night, that I noticed only when I went looking through an old drawer for the store's original set of keys to hand off in the morning. Tucked beneath a stack of decades-old receipts was a photograph I didn't remember ever seeing, of my father, younger than I ever knew him, standing in front of the very door I was about to lock, one hand raised toward the bell, not touching it, just raised, palm out, like he was either about to take it down or telling it, or someone, to stay. I did what my father would have done, what he'd trained me without meaning to across a lifetime behind that same counter. I explained it to myself in the calm, practical language he always used for things that unsettled him. The bell, old wood settling, a draft finding its way through a frame that had shifted slightly over 3 decades, nothing more. The register total, a coincidence, or a half-remembered number my own mind had supplied without my noticing, nostalgia playing tricks on an old man's memory on an emotional night. The dead thermostat reading anything at all, a residual charge in old wiring, a display holding a ghost image the way old screens sometimes do, an electrical quirk and not a message, the frost pattern, pareidolia, my mind doing what minds do at the end of something, finding a shape in the ice because I was looking for one. The photograph, a keepsake my father had simply never shown me, an ordinary picture with an ordinary pose, my own tired imagination assigning meaning to a raised hand that meant nothing at all. I finished the walkthrough telling myself all of that, and it worked, mostly, right up until the very end, standing at the door with my keys in my hand for the last time, ready to lock up and hand the building over to strangers in the morning. I reached for the bell out of 34 years of habit, meaning to unhook it from its bracket and take it home with me as a keepsake, and found I could not lift it off the wall, not stuck, not screwed down any differently than it had ever been, simply, immovably, as though something on the other side of the bracket were holding it in place from the inside of the wall itself. I stood there a long moment, my father's warning arriving in my chest all at once, 30 years too late to mean anything sensible. I left the bell exactly where it was, locked the door from the outside for the final time, and did not look back through the glass on my way to the car. The building sold the next morning. I've driven past it twice since, at a distance, on my way to other places. Both times, from the road, in the low light of early evening, I could still see that same brass bell hanging above the door, in a store I no longer own, in a building that isn't mine to walk into anymore. I found that photograph again, going through old boxes after my father passed a few years later, and showed it to my own children, half expecting them to see nothing unusual in it at all. My youngest, looking at it for barely a second, asked why Grandpa was telling the door to wait. I hadn't described the photo to her beforehand. I put it back in the box after that, and haven't taken it out since. I have never gone back to check on that bell up close. I don't plan to. If any of these have been rattling around in your head while you've been mining, or exploring, or just letting this play in the background, thank you for sticking with me through all of them, however far you made it. If you want more of these, there's more where they came from, and I'll keep bringing them. For now, get some rest, keep the lights on if you need to, and I'll see you in the next one.